The whispers followed Serafina Valthek wherever she went at New Geneva Academy, like a tide of fear and fascination that parted before her pale figure and closed again in her wake. Ethan Reeves first noticed the phenomenon during his xenobiology seminar, watching how conversations died when she entered the lecture hall and resumed in hushed, urgent tones once she'd taken her seat in the back corner, always alone, always isolated by an invisible barrier of terror that seemed to radiate from her very presence. "Don't even look at her," his roommate Jake had warned on the first day of classes. "Nosferatu can sense when you're paying attention to them. Something about psychic resonance patterns." Ethan had nodded along with the conventional wisdom, but found himself stealing glances anyway. Serafina was striking in the way that dangerous things often were. Silver-white hair that seemed to move with its own ethereal breeze, skin so pale it appeared almost translucent under the Academy's artificial lighting, and those distinctive crimson eyes that marked her species as clearly as a warning beacon. The Nosferatu. Psychic vampires from the shadow worlds beyond the galactic rim, whose people were rumored to drain life force through touch and had allegedly been involved in the destruction of 3 colony worlds during the Void Wars. The Academy's interspecies integration program insisted on calling them energy-symbiotic humanoids, but everyone knew what they really were. "Mr. Reeves," Professor Hayes called out, snapping Ethan's attention back to the lecture on parasitic relationships in xenobiology. "Since you seem particularly interested in our subject matter today, perhaps you could explain the difference between obligate and facultative parasitism?" Ethan felt heat rise to his cheeks as he realized he'd been caught staring again. Around the lecture hall, other students turned to look at him with expressions ranging from amusement to concern, while Serafina herself remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on her data pad as if she were entirely unaware of the attention focused in her direction. "Obligate parasites require their host relationship to survive," Ethan replied, grateful that at least part of his mind had been tracking the lecture. "They've evolved to be completely dependent on the resources they extract. Facultative parasites can survive independently but choose parasitism when it's advantageous." "Correct," Professor Hayes said, his tone carrying implications that made several students shift uncomfortably. "And what category would you say applies to species that have evolved specialized organs for extracting psychic energy from other consciousness-bearing beings?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Ethan could feel the collective attention of the class turning toward Serafina, whose pale hands had stilled over her data pad. For the first time since he'd been observing her, she looked up, meeting Professor Hayes' gaze with eyes that burned like distant stars. "I would say," Serafina replied, her voice carrying an accent that suggested languages older than human civilization, "that such classifications depend entirely on whether the relationship is consensual or exploitative. Obligate symbiosis can be mutually beneficial when both parties participate willingly." The temperature in the lecture hall seemed to drop several degrees. Professor Hayes' expression suggested he hadn't expected his rhetorical provocation to receive such a direct response. "An interesting perspective," he said carefully. "Though one might argue that true consent requires equal power dynamics between participants. One might also argue," Serafina continued with perfectly controlled politeness, "that academic discussions benefit from actual knowledge rather than popular prejudice." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan found himself admiring Serafina's composure even as he watched the social isolation around her solidify into something approaching active hostility. She had just committed the cardinal sin of calling out a professor's bias in front of the entire class. When the lecture ended, students filed out in clusters that carefully avoided passing too close to Serafina's seat. She remained motionless as the room emptied, her attention apparently focused on organizing her notes with mechanical precision. That's when Ethan noticed her data pad lying on the floor beside her chair, apparently dropped during her confrontation with Professor Hayes. None of the departing students had bothered to mention it, and Serafina seemed unaware of its location. Ethan found himself moving before conscious decision caught up with intention. He crossed the empty lecture hall, stepping directly into the zone of social quarantine that surrounded Serafina, and knelt to retrieve her fallen device. "You dropped this," he said simply, holding out the data pad. Serafina looked up at him with an expression of such surprise that he realized this might be the first time another student had voluntarily approached her since arriving at the academy. Up close, her features were even more striking, sharp cheekbones that suggested aristocratic breeding, lips that seemed naturally dark against her pale complexion, and those remarkable eyes that held depths of experience that seemed impossible in someone who appeared barely older than himself. "Thank you," she said softly, accepting the data pad with fingers that were careful not to brush against his own. "That was unexpected." "Dropping your data pad?" "Having someone return it." Her smile was brief but genuine, revealing teeth that were perfectly normal despite the vampire legends that surrounded her species. "Most students here seem to believe that any contact with me will result in immediate psychological domination or worse." Ethan found himself responding to her dry humor with a grin of his own. "Well, the day is young. Maybe you're just building up to the mind control." The laugh that escaped her was like music played in a minor key, beautiful but tinged with sadness. "I shall endeavor to be more dramatically threatening in future encounters." As Ethan walked back to his dormitory, he realized he was looking forward to those future encounters in ways that probably contradicted every piece of safety advice he'd received about interacting with Nosferatu. But there had been something in Serafina's eyes during their brief conversation, not the predatory hunger that the stories described, but a loneliness so profound it made his chest ache with sympathy. Perhaps that was the real danger of the Nosferatu, not that they would drain your life force, but that they might make you care about someone the entire galaxy had written off as irredeemably monstrous. The backlash from Ethan's public interaction with Serafina was swift and predictable. By dinner that evening, half his dormitory floor had heard about his vampire encounter, and the other half seemed convinced he'd been psychically compromised. "You talked to her?" Jake stared at him across their shared desk with the expression of someone whose roommate had just announced plans to juggle plutonium. "Ethan, the orientation material specifically warned against unsupervised contact with Nosferatu students." "I returned her data pad," Ethan replied, trying to keep his tone casual while reviewing his xenobiology notes. "It's called basic courtesy." "It's called species-appropriate caution," countered Lisa Park from the adjacent desk pod, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose parents worked in interspecies relations. "The Nosferatu were involved in the Void Wars for a reason. Their ability to create psychic dependencies is documented military intelligence." Ethan looked up from his notes, studying the faces of his study group with new awareness of how thoroughly the anti-Nosferatu propaganda had permeated even academic spaces. "Did any of you actually read the declassified reports from the Void Wars?" "Because I spent some time in the archives today." The uncomfortable silence suggested they hadn't. The Nosferatu involvement in colonial conflict stemmed from territorial disputes over psychic resonance zones, Ethan continued. Regions of space where ambient consciousness energy is concentrated enough to sustain their population. Human expansion kept claiming those territories for standard colonization without considering that we were essentially destroying their food sources. "That doesn't excuse the colony massacres," Jake said firmly. "No, but it explains them as acts of desperation rather than predatory behavior," Ethan replied. When your species faces extinction because another civilization keeps accidentally poisoning your habitat, violence becomes survival rather than choice. Lisa frowned at her data pad, apparently pulling up information she hadn't bothered to research before forming her opinions. "Even if that's true, it doesn't make them safe to interact with casually." "Define safe," Ethan challenged. "Because from what I observed, Serafina poses less danger to student well-being than Professor Hayes' obvious prejudice or the social isolation that everyone's enforcing around her." That evening, Ethan found himself in the Academy's vast digital archives, ostensibly working on a research paper but actually diving deep into everything he could find about Nosferatu biology and culture. What he discovered contradicted almost every assumption that galactic society had made about the species. They weren't parasites in the traditional sense. They were energy symbiotes who had evolved to process ambient psychic radiation that most species produced as unconscious byproducts of consciousness. In healthy environments, Nosferatu could feed indefinitely without causing harm to other beings, drawing sustenance from the natural overflow of mental energy that occurred wherever large populations of thinking beings gathered. The problems arose when their traditional habitats were destroyed or contaminated, forcing them into direct contact feeding that could indeed create psychological dependencies and health problems for their unwilling hosts. It was desperation, not predatory nature, that had driven them into conflict with expanding human civilization. Fascinating reading. Ethan looked up to find Serafina standing beside his secluded study corral, her pale figure almost ghostly in the archive's dim lighting. "How did you?" he began, then realized how the question would sound. "I mean, I didn't hear you approach." Light footsteps are a survival trait when most of the galaxy considers your existence a threat, Serafina replied, settling into the chair across from him with movements that seemed to flow rather than transition between positions. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I saw your research topics and wanted to thank you." "Thank me? For caring enough to look beyond the propaganda." Her crimson eyes reflected the archive's holographic displays, creating patterns of light that seemed almost hypnotic. "Most people form their opinions about my species based on entertainment media and military briefings. Few take the time to understand the actual history." Ethan studied her face, noting details that became apparent only in close proximity: the faint luminescence of her skin that suggested bioluminescent properties, the subtle points of her ears that marked her as distinctly non-human, and most significantly, the exhaustion that seemed to permeate her entire being. "Are you all right?" he asked. "You look tired." Serafina's laugh held no humor. An astute observation. "The Academy's safety protocols include inhibitor bracelets that limit my ability to access ambient psychic energy." She held up her wrists, revealing metallic bands that pulsed with soft blue light. "They're designed to prevent me from accidentally feeding on other students." "But they're preventing you from feeding at all," Ethan realized, understanding flooding through him as he connected her apparent fatigue with what he'd learned about Nosferatu nutritional requirements. "The administration believes that complete energy restriction is preferable to any risk of student harm," Serafina said quietly. "They're not entirely wrong from a liability perspective." "They're killing you," Ethan said flatly. Slowly, she agreed. "Though I doubt they see it that way. From their viewpoint, they're simply managing a potentially dangerous situation with appropriate caution." Ethan felt anger building in his chest, not the casual irritation of academic frustration, but genuine fury at the systematic cruelty being perpetrated under the guise of safety protocols. "There has to be something we can do," he said. "Medical advocacy, administrative appeals, something." Serafina's expression softened with what looked like genuine gratitude. "Your concern is unexpected and deeply appreciated. But I fear that challenging the Academy's policies would create more problems than solutions for both of us." "What if I don't care about the problems?" Ethan asked, leaning forward with intensity that surprised even him. "What if I care more about preventing institutional murder disguised as administrative procedure?" For a moment, Serafina stared at him with an expression that seemed to catalog every detail of his face, as if memorizing something precious that she might never encounter again. "Then you would be the first person in over a century to risk personal consequences for the welfare of my people," she said softly. "And I would be more grateful than you could possibly understand." As they sat together in the archive's quiet glow, Ethan realized that his initial curiosity about the lonely girl everyone feared had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than academic interest. He was beginning to care about Serafina Valthek in ways that had nothing to do with interspecies diplomacy and everything to do with the growing certainty that letting her suffer in silence would be a betrayal of everything he believed about justice and human decency. The collapse happened during advanced xenobiology, 3 weeks after Ethan had begun his personal research into Nosferatu physiology and Academy discrimination policies. One moment Serafina was taking notes on symbiotic relationships in deep space ecosystems, and the next she was unconscious on the classroom floor, her pale skin having gone completely translucent so that the blue tracery of her circulatory system was visible beneath the surface. Everyone back, Professor Hayes commanded, though his voice carried uncertainty rather than authority as he stared at Seraphina's motionless form. "Someone alert medical services." Ethan pushed through the circle of students who had gathered to stare, dropping to his knees beside Seraphina and checking for vital signs with the basic medical training that was mandatory for all academy students. Her pulse was barely detectable, her breathing shallow and irregular, and her skin felt cold as ice. "She needs immediate medical attention," Ethan called out, cradling Seraphina's head while trying to determine if she was in immediate danger of cardiac arrest. "Medical is on the way," Jake reported from the classroom's communication panel. "ETA 3 minutes. But Ethan could see that 3 minutes might be too long. Seraphina's lips were turning blue, and the faint bioluminescence that normally characterized her skin was fading like dying starlight. When the medical team arrived, they treated Seraphina's condition with professional efficiency and troubling detachment. Dr. Sarah Kim, the Academy's chief physician, conducted a rapid assessment that seemed more concerned with contamination protocols than patient welfare. "Vital signs are within acceptable parameters for her species," Dr. Kim announced after consulting her scanner readings. "Nosferatu often enter dormancy states during periods of psychic energy depletion. She'll recover with rest." "She's unconscious and barely breathing," Ethan protested. "How is that within acceptable parameters?" "Mr. Reeves," Dr. Kim replied with the tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child, "Nosferatu physiology is adapted for extended periods of low metabolic activity. What appears critical to human observation is simply normal hibernation behavior for her species." Ethan watched as the medical team transferred Seraphina to a diagnostic gurney, noting how they handled her with mechanical precision rather than the careful attention usually given to critically ill patients. Something about their casual attitude toward her condition felt fundamentally wrong. That evening, Ethan went directly to Academy Director Morrison's office, armed with research data and a formal complaint about discriminatory medical treatment. "Mr. Reeves," Director Morrison said, reviewing Ethan's compiled evidence with the expression of an administrator who had dealt with student advocacy before, "I understand your concern for your fellow students' well-being. However, the safety protocols surrounding Nosferatu students exist for compelling reasons." "Safety protocols that are slowly killing her," Ethan replied, sliding a data pad across Morrison's desk. "I've analyzed the specifications for those inhibitor bracelets she's required to wear. They're not just limiting her psychic abilities, they're preventing her from accessing the ambient energy she needs for basic survival." Morrison glanced at the data but didn't seem particularly interested in the physiological details. "The protocols were developed in consultation with interspecies medical authority and approved by the Colonial Defense Department. They represent the current standard for managing potentially dangerous psychic species in educational environments." "She's not dangerous," Ethan insisted. "She's a refugee whose species has been systematically persecuted to the brink of extinction. The Academy is supposed to be promoting interspecies understanding, not perpetuating genocide through bureaucratic negligence." "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Reeves," Morrison said, his tone shifting toward warning. "I'd advise caution in how you characterize Academy policies." Frustrated by the institutional stonewalling and increasingly desperate about Seraphina's deteriorating condition, Ethan spent the next several days researching alternative solutions. What he found in the restricted medical databases was both hopeful and terrifying. Voluntary psychic energy sharing between compatible species was theoretically possible, but it required intimate mental contact that could create permanent consciousness bonds between participants. The procedure was documented in only a handful of cases, mostly involving Nosferatu who had formed deep emotional relationships with members of other species. The risks were significant: potential psychological fusion, permanent memory sharing, and in some cases, complete personality integration that left both participants fundamentally changed. But it was also the only way to provide Seraphina with the energy she needed without removing the inhibitor bracelets that the Academy would never agree to modify. Ethan was still debating the wisdom of attempting something so dangerous when Jake found him in their dormitory, frantically packing medical supplies into an emergency kit. "What's the crisis?" Jake asked, noting the portable scanners and energy supplements that Ethan was collecting. Serafina hasn't regained consciousness, Ethan replied, checking the charge level on a neural interface device he'd borrowed from the advanced biology lab. It's been 2 days, and the medical staff keeps insisting that everything is normal for her species. Maybe it is normal, Jake suggested carefully. I mean, we don't really understand Nosferatu biology. I understand it well enough to recognize that she's dying, Ethan said firmly. Her body is consuming itself because she can't access the energy she needs for basic cellular function. If something doesn't change in the next few hours, the damage will become irreversible. Jake studied his roommate's face with growing concern. Ethan, what exactly are you planning to do? Ethan met his friend's gaze with resolution that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I'm planning to do something that the Academy would definitely classify as dangerous, unauthorized, and probably illegal. And I'm planning to do it anyway, Ethan replied, because the alternative is watching someone I care about die from institutional indifference. As he left the dormitory carrying his improvised medical kit, Ethan realized that he was about to cross a line that would fundamentally change not just his relationship with Serafina, but his understanding of what it meant to truly connect with another conscious being across the vast differences that separated their species. Ethan found Serafina in the Academy's medical isolation wing, her unconscious form connected to monitoring equipment that displayed vital signs so weak they barely registered as life. The overnight medical technician had been easy to convince that he was there for an approved study session. Apparently, the staff assumed that anyone willing to spend time with a Nosferatu patient must have official authorization. In the dim lighting of the medical bay, Serafina looked fragile in ways that contradicted every story about her species' supernatural strength. Her silver hair had lost its ethereal luster, and her skin had become so translucent that he could trace the fading patterns of bioluminescence beneath the surface like dying constellations. Serafina, he whispered, settling into the chair beside her bed and unpacking the neural interface equipment he'd borrowed from the biology lab. I hope you can hear me, because I'm about to do something that might save your life or get us both in serious trouble. Her only response was the shallow rise and fall of her chest, but the medical monitors indicated slight changes in brain activity that suggested some level of consciousness remained. Ethan activated the neural interface device, following procedures he'd memorized from restricted medical texts that were never meant for student access. The theory was simple: establish a direct consciousness connection that would allow him to share psychic energy voluntarily, bypassing the inhibitor bracelets that prevented Serafina from feeding naturally. The reality was considerably more complex and dangerous. The first touch of mental contact hit him like lightning, flooding his awareness with sensations and memories that were definitively not his own. Images cascaded through his consciousness. Vast cities of crystal and shadow, star systems he'd never seen, faces of beings whose beauty was matched only by their sadness. Through the connection, he could feel Serafina's desperate hunger, a gnawing emptiness that had been consuming her from within for weeks. But beneath the physical need was something else: surprise, gratitude, and a loneliness so profound that it made Ethan's heart ache with sympathetic pain. Ethan, her mental voice was weak but unmistakably present. What are you doing? Saving you, he replied through the connection, consciously directing his own psychic energy toward her consciousness. Just hold on. The energy transfer felt like pouring part of his soul into an endless void, but gradually he began to sense changes in Serafina's condition. Color returned to her skin, her breathing deepened, and the monitors showed strengthening vital signs that indicated genuine recovery rather than temporary stabilization. But the process was creating unexpected side effects. As Serafina fed on his freely given energy, their consciousness began to merge in ways that the medical literature had warned about but never adequately described. Ethan found himself experiencing fragments of her memories, centuries of persecution, the gradual extinction of her species, the desperate hope that had led her to the Academy despite knowing she would face isolation and hostility. Simultaneously, Serafina was experiencing his thoughts and emotions, including the growing affection he felt for her and his fury at the systematic discrimination that had brought her so close to death. 200 years, she whispered through their mental connection, her thoughts tinged with wonder. 200 years since someone touched my mind without fear or revulsion. I had forgotten what genuine kindness felt like. You shouldn't have had to remember. Ethan replied, his consciousness expanding to accommodate the shared awareness that was forming between them. No one should be forced to survive alone. The bonding process reached completion as the first rays of artificial dawn began filtering through the medical bay's windows. Seraphina's eyes opened, truly opened, with full consciousness and vitality restored, while Ethan felt a strange doubling of perception that allowed him to see through both his own eyes and hers simultaneously. The connection is permanent, Seraphina said softly, sitting up with movements that showed complete recovery from her near-death state. You understand what that means? Ethan nodded, feeling her knowledge of Nosferatu physiology flowing through their shared consciousness. I understand that you'll never have to starve again. And I understand that we're bound together in ways that transcend normal relationships. Are you afraid? She asked, studying his face with eyes that now held warmth instead of the cold distance he'd observed during their first meeting. Terrified, Ethan admitted honestly. And grateful, and excited, and completely uncertain about what happens next. Seraphina's smile was radiant, transforming her features from merely beautiful to genuinely luminous. What happens next is that we prove to the galaxy that cooperation between species is possible when it's based on mutual respect and voluntary connection. The aftermath of their bonding created waves of controversy that extended far beyond the Academy. Director Morrison's attempt to expel Ethan for unauthorized medical experimentation was blocked by the sudden attention of interspecies rights advocates who recognized the implications of their successful energy-sharing partnership. Dar. Kim's medical evaluation revealed that the consciousness bond had not only saved Seraphina's life but created a sustainable feeding relationship that eliminated the need for inhibitor bracelets or isolation protocols. For the first time in Academy history, a Nosferatu student could participate fully in educational activities without being treated as a containment risk. More significantly, their relationship attracted the attention of other Nosferatu survivors scattered across the galaxy, refugees who had been living in hiding, slowly starving in isolation rather than risk the persecution that came with revealing their true nature. There are fewer than 800 of us left, Seraphina explained during one of their evening conversations, her head resting against Ethan's shoulder as they reviewed applications from other Nosferatu seeking admission to the Academy's expanded integration program. Your willingness to form a voluntary bond has given hope to people who had resigned themselves to extinction. 6 months later, Ethan stood before the Galactic Council's Committee on Species Preservation, testifying about the success of voluntary symbiotic relationships between humans and Nosferatu. Beside him, Seraphina wore the formal robes of a cultural ambassador, her role transformed from isolated refugee to advocate for her species' rehabilitation. The Nosferatu are not parasites, Ethan told the assembled delegates. They are partners whose unique abilities can benefit all conscious species when relationships are formed through mutual consent and genuine understanding. Through their permanent bond, he could feel Seraphina's gratitude and love, emotions that had grown from their initial connection into something that transcended the boundaries between different forms of consciousness. Their relationship had proven that the galaxy's most feared species could become its most valuable allies, given the opportunity to form connections based on trust rather than terror. As the Council voted to establish sanctuary worlds for Nosferatu refugees and fund expanded research into voluntary symbiotic relationships, Ethan reflected on the simple act of returning a dropped data pad that had led to this moment. Sometimes the most profound changes in the universe began with nothing more complicated than choosing compassion over fear, and recognizing that the beings everyone warned you not to approach might be exactly the ones who most needed someone to reach out. The warnings had meant nothing when he saw the sorrow in her eyes. Now, through their shared consciousness, that sorrow had been replaced by hope for a future where no one would have to face extinction alone.